Hello Stormy, welcome to this interview. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm glad to be here.
Great. You're the executive director at GNOME since a few months, right?
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about your role at GNOME.
Yeah, so I started at the GNOME Foundation in July. I'm the executive director. So the GNOME Foundation exists to support the GNOME project. So we have funding and we use that money to help the project out, primarily by sponsoring things like events, flying developers to those events, sponsoring projects like usability studies or accessibility work that might not be getting done right now by the volunteers, but is important to them. So in my new role, I'm working with the sponsors to make sure that they're working effectively with the GNOME Foundation and the GNOME project. I'm working on GNOME marketing, working on different projects like GNOME Mobile, or making sure that we launch different business initiatives as they come up.
What is the most important aspect when it comes to marketing GNOME?
The most important aspect is probably figuring out what the community wants to say about GNOME. So figuring out what the consensus is, if there is a consensus, and what we want to say about it.
You mean positioning the product?
Positioning the product in the community. So I think there's very much a feel in the GNOME community of community, and many of them are working on it for the same reasons. They want a product that's on the desktop, that's free, that's accessible, that's usable. So there's very much a common theme to the community, but figuring out why you want to market it or who you want to market it to is more difficult.
What was the most recent marketing work that you did for GNOME?
Well, what I'm working on right now is our Friends of GNOME project is our project for accepting donations from individuals. And I want to relaunch those pages in a way that appeals to more people. For example, right now it doesn't explain what GNOME is, so it's very much targeted at GNOME developers themselves. And I want to launch it with a broader focus to the general public. So that's what I'm working on right now.
What is your goal? Why do you want to do that?
My goal is outreach, to teach more people about GNOME so that they know that it's there for them to use, that it's a free desktop, that it has lots of features, it's an alternative to the proprietary desktop they're using, and also to raise money for the GNOME project so that we can fly more developers to conferences, support more things that developers need to develop a better GNOME for the public.
You have experience working with very large companies and mid-size companies. What's the difference when marketing a community-driven project like GNOME compared to a company?
Yeah, so I worked at HP for 10 years, and then I worked at OpenLogic. And at OpenLogic, I actually worked in the marketing team. So I joke that the biggest difference is when I came to GNOME Foundation, there was nobody that made business cards. I got to design my own template and print them. I mean, it's that small. But that's just kind of the difference between a small company and a large company. The other difference is at companies, there's a team that's the marketing team that directly reports into the CEO at some level, and they have the agenda for marketing, and they get to make all the decisions. In the GNOME Foundation, the marketing team is volunteers that signed up on the marketing mailing list. They may or may not have a marketing background. They may or may not be available this week to work on something, and they don't directly report to anybody that can say, yes, that's okay. So it's very much finding people that want to work on it with you, coming up with good ideas, putting them out there to the community, getting feedback, and at some point feeling like you have enough feedback that you can say, okay, this is good, the community bought into it, we can move forward.
So basically you're building a community-driven marketing effort within GNOME. How do you think can you best achieve that goal?
Yeah, so I should give credit to the people before me. So there was a GNOME marketing community before I got there, and a marketing mailing list and people working on it. So the group is already there, and I'm helping drive some new goals and some new ideas that we want to do. So this is the GNOME annual report. All of the content was done by volunteers before I got to GNOME, and it's been really useful and a really valuable tool to show companies and people what GNOME is doing, who the people are that are working on it, some of the things that excite and motivate the community. So I just wanted to share it as something that I think the GNOME project has done a really good job in making this annual report available to our sponsors and others that really highlights the great things that GNOME did in 2007.
Within that group, do you have specialists who are good in event management, who are good in public relations work?
So we have a little bit of everything. GNOME actually has an annual event, GWADEC, that is always run by volunteers, and it's phenomenal. I'm very impressed with open source conferences like GWADEC that are completely run by volunteers. And it's not necessarily the same volunteers every year. Some conferences like Scale are the same volunteers. LinuxConf Australia and GNOME, it's a new set every year. And it runs phenomenal. So that expertise for event running is already there and working, I don't want to say perfectly, but stupendously. So some of the things that we need to work on next are, the web pages, and we have graphics designers, we have people that know HTML and CSS and things like that. So it's really just about energizing people around a topic, and the experts have been awesome about just volunteering.
Concerning the website and the positioning of GNOME, what are the changes you want to apply to the website?
So the website, again, I have to give credit to the people before me. The whole revamp has been happening before I got there. So I think what I would like to introduce is more language that addresses people that don't have a background in open source software in GNOME. I think one of the things that the community needs help with is reaching out to the very end users, the ones that don't already know about open source software, because we get a lot of feedback from people that are in the community.
Concerning marketing budget, of course there are a lot of people who work on marketing at GNOME for free, so to say. But if you compare it to the companies where you worked, what would it be in terms of money? What kind of budget does GNOME have at hand virtually to do marketing?
So if I added up all the volunteer efforts, how much would it be? I don't know enough to know yet. So there's, on the mailing list, you can see the list of email addresses of the people that are signed up. And I know the people that have been vocal over the last couple months, but I don't really yet know the level of effort that everyone's spending on it. So ask me again next year.
Okay. How do you reach consensus within the GNOME community when it comes to marketing activities or focusing marketing and positioning the GNOME product?
Yeah, so I'm still working on that personally. We have a couple of formal official tools. For example, the GNOME Foundation has members, which are all the contributors to GNOME that have applied for membership. So we have 400 voting members. So for something really big, you could do a vote. And you could get everybody to actually say what they thought one way or the other. We also have an elected board of directors who has the authority to make day-to-day decisions. But imagine it was a marketing effort that was pretty substantial, like a tagline or something that was very representative of GNOME. I'm not exactly 100% sure how you reach consensus. I mean, you could do a vote. In the past, they've done polling, so they've actually put out, they did some kind of brainstorming and they came up with like 10 taglines and put it in a poll, and everybody got an opportunity to go kind of vote on the poll. But it's a dilemma because you're never actually going to reach 100% agreement. And so at what point do you decide from a mailing list that you have enough agreement to move forward?
I guess the problem with positioning a company or an open source project is about making a decision on the one option that you want to continue working on. And the same problem in a company, I guess, if you would have a vote mechanism in a company about the positioning of the product, there would be many different opinions about it. And that might be one of the major problems within open source communities. Do you have an idea how to tackle that, how to get consensus?
Well, I actually wouldn't say it's one of the problems, it's one of the difficulties. But I think companies, that's one of the things that they're missing. And I've seen this conflict. So if you watch an open source software developer who works at a traditional company, if he thinks a feature that you're adding or a way you're doing marketing is wrong, he'll argue it, which is great. And then you'll see the manager who's not used to the open source community say, no, this is the way we're doing it. And the developer who comes from the open source background says, but no, you don't understand, blah, 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 blah. And the manager goes, no, this is the way we're doing it. And the developer says, no, I can't do it that way. This is not right. And the next thing you know, the developer's fired, and the manager, because his manager gave him a direct order and he didn't listen. Or they go into passive aggressive where, So I think companies need to learn that you have to get buy-in from all the developers on your team. And if they're really protesting and saying, I won't do this because I don't believe it's right, there's something missing in your communication effort. At the same time, in the open source community, when you do that for several hundred people, it's very difficult, right? And often you see flame wars that happen on mailing lists, and you don't always get everybody to say, yeah, buy in. Often you have quite a few people that say, well, all right, I don't really agree, but go ahead. But I think it forces the communication to go to the next level. It doesn't shut people up that have an opinion.
I wonder, maybe part of the difficulty is because GNOME is an early phase project that has been started by developers simply because there was a need for a Linux desktop. Maybe in the future we will see more open source projects or products that have been started with a business background, so their marketing comes first or is part of the first decisions, while at GNOME marketing maybe becomes at the end, now that it already reached a certain visibility. What do you think? Is that a proper way of looking at it?
I think the GNOME community would come back and say, well, why do you need marketing? And they need marketing for different reasons, and some of them feel differently. But I think in general, they made a project that they believe in that does the job. It's been picked up by many Linux distributions because it did what it needed to do and it did it well. Currently, GNOME gets rebranded often by the Linux distribution, so it's not, end users don't know they're using GNOME. So one question that you could ask is that an issue, right? Like, does GNOME need marketing, or does it just need relationships with the distributions?
Did you analyze the brand identity of GNOME, and did you think about how to change it and how to make it more visible?
So one of the things that I joked about doing was making GNOME like the Intel inside, so like the GNOME inside. And I think there's ways we could do that. I think GNOME has very strong tools when it comes to logos and brands. They've got that infrastructure. We could put together like rebranding guidelines for the Linux distribution saying, you must leave the GNOME foot or icon in these following 3 places, and here's where you can put your icon. So we could do something like that if we decided that we wanted to market GNOME to that end user.
What is the most important goal for you concerning marketing at GNOME?
The most important goal to me is making sure that we're reaching the right people with the right message, and that the community atmosphere, the community environment comes across in that message, because I think to the average person or to the average company person, understanding that the feeling of the GNOME community and how dedicated they are to having a free desktop that's accessible, that's usable, I think that's very appealing to people and very valuable.
When is the year of the Linux desktop?
Every year from 5 years ago till 10 years from now. I've said it's this year. I really think that the netbooks, the small, very cheap laptops are definitely bringing Linux to a huge number of people. I mean, 500,000 people this year that probably didn't use Linux now have a little netbook that runs Linux, boots extremely fast. I mean, you only have to boot it in front of someone who has a Windows machine and they go, what's that? So I don't know if this is the year of the desktop, but this is definitely a year where it's starting to grow fast.
Great. Thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks.